Joshua mentioned he can't join today.
Right, yeah, Josh has other things going on, and Pat's not here, so good call on pressing the record button. I forgot. Now we're recording. All right, so MR total for April was 7, so might be a good idea to work on that for an OKR for Q2. Talked about it before. There's an iteration training template out there. Giannis already signed up for it. Thank you, Giannis. And we can exercise one of the steps in there where we actually pull in some examples of issues that we worked on throughout the quarter and talk about how we could have iterated on them, broken them down, and with the ultimate goal of increasing our throughput. So I will add that to our draft for OKRs, and we can talk about it later on this week. Something else that came up this last week was looking at deliverable labels. Have either of you used those before? All right. So
not actively, no.
Yeah, which ones?
There's a label called deliverable, and it's typically used more with feature teams, right? When they are committing to trying to release a feature within a milestone. And sadly, with the database team, a lot of the issues that we get are late breaking, come in during the milestone, or are not very well broken down when we start the milestone. So I haven't really been pushing for the deliverable use. We got asked about it this last time. There was an issue to kind of work on iteration to look at targets for deliverables. So much like everything else, there's a 70% goal for hitting deliverable targets. We didn't label anything as deliverables, which is fine. It's not something we've talked about. It's not something we've trained or even started using. So it's something that we can talk about when we have that planning meeting, when we talk about how we want to plan for milestones, and then we can start using the deliverable label in 13.1. So it's not something we need to be super concerned with right now, but something we need to use going forward. And we can talk more about details about how and what's required there when we actually go through how we want to plan session. So. And then there was a Slack conversation where we talked about what kind of access patterns are we looking for to help with some of the sharding prototypes, so we can actually prove that it works in certain areas. So, and I quoted the Slack conversation here, and based on a conversation Josh and I had later on, these were some of the paths that we talked about. I'm sure nobody's had a chance to look at these or even think about it, but something to take a look at. I can add this, if I haven't already, to the access isolation issue, and we can discuss asynchronously. We'll do that. Any questions on any of those? Probably not.
I wasn't sure what they exactly mean or what the exact feature is. Should we go through the list now, or should we do it later?
Let's do it when Josh is around, because he's going to have
Sure.
some more details as well. But this was just top of mind thinking when we were talking about what features, what are users seeing when they're using GitLab, and what's slow, and what maybe would partitioning and sharding help with. So these were just some of the access patterns that came to mind when we were talking about it. The OKR issue is out there. Please provide feedback. I have a draft out there. I was wrong on the dates. I thought it was due on the 8th, but it was due on Friday. And the fact that we have an issue is good enough for now. We can continue to revise it over the next week or two and make sure that we're all on board. We all agree with the goals, and they're meaningful goals. They're specific enough that we can actually accomplish them. So take a look, and we will continue to revise them over the next week or so. And as I referenced above, during an office hour session, probably maybe plan for Thursday. I think tomorrow we need to talk more about partitioning and sharding, but on Thursday we can talk about how we want to start doing planning, because there were a lot of suggestions that have flown around, and getting the team more involved on the planning sessions would be good. We don't have a full-time dedicated product manager between Josh and I. We're doing the best that we can, but now that we have a bigger team, we all are chewing through the backlog faster, and we need to make sure that we're doing a good job of getting specific issues out there and getting feedback from everybody, and we're doing the right things. So we'll work on that on Thursday. plan for Thursday if everybody's here.
Is there something we can prepare for that session or make it more explicit what we expect from that, or so that we can think about it ahead of time?
Yep, I'll work on an agenda there.
Awesome, thank you.
And I'll probably just use this doc for an agenda.
Hmm.
Or, nah, I'll work on something. Make a note and make sure I don't forget. Let's see. So jumping all the way down to work items. So there were a couple issues that I added to the milestone. And Andreas has commented on those. So migration bug found by a customer.
I think that's another instance of something we already know of. I linked the canonical issue for that. It's rather non-trivial fixing that or figuring out what happened there. I think last time we had it, we were sort of making a note to the canonical issue. I did the same now. Should we work on that now, or is that something we push out more?
Probably need to understand how pervasive it is, like how frequently customers are running into this issue and how painful the workaround is. Because if it's infrequent and it has an easy workaround, then we shouldn't prioritize it. But if it happens a lot and it's painful for the customers, then we should bring it in. But thanks for the review. Do we have any data on how often this happens or how painful the workaround is?
I saw 4 instances, I think, linked on that issue. The workaround is trivial as soon as you know what you have to do. But discovering that is maybe not as easy or obviously not easy for customers.
Was there a specific path? Are they jumping from one specific version to another that caused it? I don't recall the background on this one, but it seemed like it was an infrequent problem. Wondering if documentation would just help solve this problem instead of us fixing it. Like you said, if it's a difficult problem to solve, then we just mark it as a known issue and provide the documentation for how to fix it when you encounter.
That's probably an option, yes. On the other hand, we shouldn't have those inconsistencies in the first place. So it might pay off in the long run, figuring out where they come from or have some guards against those inconsistencies. Because what happens is basically that over time, the schema that some installations have deviates from the schema that we expect them to have. And that's a problem when you do later migration, is because you rely on the information that you have.
What are the customers are changing their data structure then? Is that what's happening, their schema?
No, I think that one is on us. So we've had a couple of points in the history where we introduced inconsistencies to the schema that we give out for new installations. And that schema is somehow different than the one that existing installations have. And then, we have to deal with that difference. But at this point, I think what I remember from last time is that we don't really know where this come from or what the differences are. So in this case, there were just 2 indexes sitting around with the same definition, and a later migration was trying to drop one of them, but the migration helper bails out as soon as it realizes that, there is 2 like similar indexes. Which one do you want me to drop? And then it bails out. Like, I don't know. We could be fixing that index migration helper problem and making that more eager to drop both indexes in that case. In the case they're the same. That might be an easy fix, but I don't know if that's all the inconsistency issues we have.
As a longer-term solution, maybe we will use the fact that we are using structure.sql and try to figure out what's missing from schemas and add those or remove things. Like a tool that fixes schemas.
Yeah, would also be useful to look at GitLab.com, for example, which is a large, or a long-running installation, you could say, and compare that to the schema that we have on the code base to fix any like inconsistencies. And the other way to look at this is we should have tooling in place that makes sure that our migration code is consistent with the schema that we check into the code base, because that's where the problem comes from. We have we apply migrations to existing installations, and then we create new installations based on the schema that we check into the code base, and those have to be consistent. And at some points in the past, we managed to miss changes that we introduced or check in the wrong ones or stuff like that.
Is this something we can push off to the teams that created those indexes to have them fix it? Or is this something that's more central to us and we need to provide a tool to, like you said, be more eager about removing the duplicate indexes?
I think that's something we should be doing. It's more of a systematic kind of database problem, I think.
Okay. Yeah, take a look at this. Maybe it can be something we consider for 13.1 if we have bandwidth. Right. Okay. So the
second one.
Yeah.
The migration itself is totally fine. However, that wasn't executed on the installation that we see here. And that leads to this error message, basically a column that is missing from the database, but the application code expects it to be there. The migration itself is totally fine. We don't know yet if that migration didn't run or was rolled back or something like that. So I've asked for more details, but it doesn't look like any kind of migration related issue. Maybe rather something that happens when you do an upgrade and then there is an error for some unrelated reason. It looks like something like this. So rather related to the upgrade process itself and how we apply those database migrations in it.
Okay. Thanks for taking a look at this. We have the sharding working group coming up, and I was going to talk about this comment from Andreas. Is there anything else related to the database team you all want to talk about before we jump over this? Anybody blocked? Need any feedback or help on anything? So on this one, can you kind of expand on your comment here? I think this is, I've already gotten feedback on this one, so it's going to be a controversial statement to say the least if you're saying we should use a separate database for the container registry.
Yeah, I mean, I've expanded what I mean with that on the comment that is linked. Is that any helpful, or do you think it's still controversial?
It's still controversial. I mean, and this is going to point to my lack of knowledge about. I know there's a couple different understandings of what's going to actually be in this database, but I think if you're recommending a separate database altogether for the container registry application, it's going to go against the goal of having a single database, even if it's in its own separate schema, right? Going against the goal of the single data store, single application to support our sales. So I'm just wondering why you're still recommending a separate database.
So my understanding is that, or maybe I missed an update on that, or the final conclusion that, so maybe that's the case here, but my understanding was that we basically reached a point where we said that we recommend using separate databases, so we don't want multiple applications use the same logical database for good reasons. And if we wanted to have this data in the same database, then the functionality itself, also the container registry service, that would also need to live in the Rails database. This is my understanding of that, and that's what I think I expressed with that comment. Is that not the case, or have we made a decision against that approach yet?
Yeah, I think there's some terminology clashing going on. So, so I don't think the application, I don't think the functionality of the container registry makes sense to be built into the Rails app, right? There's some minimal set of functionality, and maybe John and Dan will clear that up today. But where they need a database, I think the request still stands that it lives in the same database. And I think the separation we're talking about is it doesn't make sense for it to be in the Rails database as tables within the Rails database and managed by Rails, because as commented in this issue, they'd basically have to start from scratch and rebuild the whole thing, right? And have it be an integrated part of the Rails app. So I don't think anybody's suggesting that, but what the suggestion is to have it as its own schema in the same database so that customers still have that single data store.
Okay, I think in that case, we're actually talking about the same thing, maybe using different words for
that. Okay.
Then
let's get clear, because I know that people are asking if you are recommending a completely different database.
Okay, so maybe we can do a quick recap of the terms and see if that's the same thing we think about that. So in Postgres terminology, there is a database cluster. That's basically a group of database instances. They replicate each other or from the primary. So this is rather the physical setting. So database cluster is a full set of it's a full database. You run that on multiple instances, whatever. Then there is a database that is that lives on a database cluster, right? That is a logical sort of entity in a database cluster. And in that database, you can have your tables, basically, or the database schema for your application, right? What Postgres also supports is doing schemas. So Postgres schemas, they live inside a database, and the only thing they do is group or act as a group mechanic for tables. So you can basically group them logically in the same database, right? You could have, I don't know, you have one application having two separate features, they don't overlap or whatever. You want to group tables logically, you use schemas for that. There is typically, in our case, there is only one schema, the public schema, but you could have more. It is just a logical grouping, and you can also do cross.
Namespace.
It's a namespace, exactly. You can also do cross schema queries. It's not a problem. But that's totally up to you. What I'm talking about here in that comment is a database. So that is a logical separation on the same cluster. Perhaps also a different cluster. That's up to you. But in the standard Omnibus install, it would be the same database. And the idea is that you don't want more than one application sharing the same database, right? Because then you make the database an act of a form of communication between applications, and that's really difficult to manage.
Also, the user for the other database has no rights to delete the GitLab HQ database, which is important.
For example, and schema management really is a pain if you have multiple different applications sort of trying to do that in the same database. And that what you can argue is, and that what popped up in the conversation as well, is doing one database and having each application own their own schema in the database.
Yes.
The point I'm making in that comment is that that doesn't make any sense if there is no overlap between those two schemas, and that's exactly what we don't want. We don't want one application to talk across its own sort of part of the database, right? It owns a few tables and it should only use them and not use other tables owned by a different application. And if you don't need that, there is no reason to use this pattern where you put applications into their own schema, because there is no overlap between schemas in the first place, right?
Also, from a logical perspective, it's better if you're going to separate them, why not put them in different databases so that you skip any problems, any wrong assumptions, databases inside the database cluster. So it's the same. You skip any assumptions that they reside in the same database. So if you have to separate them for GitLab.com, for example, you won't have the small issues that you may have between cross-database queries. I don't know if...
Exactly.
So I understood what you said, and it still goes against what Sid wants. So, and as he put it, the two turbos that drive our revenue. So it's a database proliferation problem. And I understand the downfall of having separate schemas for separate applications within the same database, right? I'll leave opinions aside on that one. The request is for us to make it all work in one database and continue to support that single application, single data store. That is a huge selling point and part of our IACV. And if we cannot do that, then we need to have data as to why, or if it's going to be inefficient, problematic, cause us, I guess, inhibit our ability to sell in the future because we have so many problems, like we exhaust our connection pool, or whatever other reason, we need actual data and prototypes behind it instead of best practices. Does that make sense?
I'm not sure. I mean, it's sort of an architecture design problem as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
And going back to my comment, I'm saying that if we had a good reason to do the same database queries together with data from Rails, the logical conclusion is, in the same database, the logical conclusion is that we would have to put container registry code into GitLab Rails. So what I'm not seeing here is why, if we don't want, or if we really want a single database, what that automatically means is that we have a single application as well. And in fact, we're saying single application, single database. So why are we talking about container registry being a separate service in the first place? That's what doesn't make sense to me. We can either cramp it all into one monolith application, if that's what we want, or we do it separately. But let's not put a separate application into the same database. And I don't think we need data for that, frankly. That's a design problem.
Understood. This is...
Yeah, that's a great point. So, and from an open source perspective, if this is a separate project, and it is a separate project because we think that people will use it by itself, why use the GitLab database? So, do people using this? Are people going to use it on itself? And if they are not, why it's not part of a GitLab code base? And if we have it as a separate thing because we think people are going to use it, are people going to need to run the migrations for GitLab?
That's a great point. Yeah, and if you run it standalone and you also need data from GitLab, then you can't do it standalone, right?
Yeah, and I think that's a product question they're going to have to answer. Do they want this to be standalone? And if they don't, does it need to be an integrated piece of GitLab? And if that's the case, does it need to be rewritten, right? So I think there's a product stakeholder that needs to be involved in that conversation. And the questions you're asking about it being a standalone service, I know there's an answer for it. I think it can be, and if we bring it into GitLab, it removes the ability to plug in other features, and I can't remember what it is. So, are you, Andreas? I think you added as tentative to joining the sharding working group. Are you going to be able to make it?
Yes, right now
Okay.
after this meeting, right? Yeah.
Yep. So if you can ask that question during the meeting, and I'll take notes because I don't remember the specifics behind it, but there was, if we brought it
Maybe
in,
there
it
are
would limit.
historical reasons also, because we were using a Docker image for the container. So it was a separate thing either way until now. Maybe it's historical, the reason. I don't know, Andreas, maybe you know more about this one.
I don't actually. I have a coffee call chat scheduled with somebody from the team to discuss that this week to learn more.
So we'll learn more here in a couple minutes. All right. Thanks for the feedback. Sorry I didn't have more answers for you. I guess we'll continue the conversation in a couple minutes. And Giannis, you're more than welcome to join. I don't know if you're invited to that working group or not. I can add you to the calendar if you want.
I'm joining all meetings I can.
All right. Well, I will end this one and jump over to the next one then.
All right.
Thanks.
Bye.